Hey everybody, it's Erik Torenberg, co-founder, partner of Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is Venture Stories, a podcast covering topics relating to tech and business with world-leading experts. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Village Global's Venture Stories. I'm here today with a very special guest, Eli Dourado. Eli, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on, Erik.
So Eli, by way of introduction, why don't you talk about how you define your work and the questions that you keep exploring?
Sure. Yeah, that's a little challenging, actually. More for me than other people, maybe. I am really just obsessed with the idea of growth and how we could get a lot more of it, economic growth. And I am very interested in sort of diving into like the nitty gritty and the specific reasons that we're not getting it. So, and that means immersing myself in the sort of the technologies that I think could make it possible. And then also thinking a lot about the barriers that are making it not happen. And a lot of those are in the policy space. So I work at a policy research center at Utah State University called Center for Growth and Opportunity. And I just basically try to chip away at those barriers and try to bring them down.
And you recently, in the past couple of months, had a viral blog post talking about where you see technology going in the 2020s. Why don't you unpack that post a little bit, and also let's talk about the responses to it and how your thoughts have evolved since writing it.
Sure. Yeah, that sounds great. I mean, the background on this is like the stagnation that we've had over the last 50 years, right? So my PhD advisor, Tyler Cowen, wrote a book called The Great Stagnation. And I'm very much like building off of like his worldview on this. And we've had that basically slow total factor productivity growth, which is kind of the metric that we look at for the last 50 years. And so the question is like, could we get out of that? Is there a way forward? And there's a bunch of like smart friends of mine that are like, yeah, like we're definitely gonna like the roaring 20s are coming. And so I just wanted to take a sort of look without prejudging the answer to that question, just take a look at sort of the different technological domains that to watch, right? And so kind of a handful that I'm really interested in are like biotech and health. I think that there's some interesting stuff going on there. Energy, transportation and space. So in all of those different areas, there's some really interesting things going on, and also some barriers. And so kind of trying to look at those different areas and figure out how to make things, what the post is really about, like what am I watching and what are the opportunities.
And before getting into that, I want to zoom out and talk about one of your goals, or your fondest wish, you say in your website, is that GDP per capita reaches 200K by 2050. For sort of the uninitiated, so to speak, why is this so important? What have you found sort of the best way to describe to, normies or people who are not as familiar as to why this is so groundbreaking? Because it doesn't sort of capture the heartstrings in the way it should.
Yeah. So, I mean, I go back to like when I was like a 9-year-old boy, and like all I wanted for Christmas was the World Almanac. Right. So like, I actually like wanted this like book of statistics and so on to like be able to look at, and I would like plot out like what the GDP statistics were like over time per capita and stuff, and like plot out, okay, by the time I am a 40-year-old man, like this is going to be my standard of living, right? And so for me, it's just this is just I don't think it's normal at all. I think it's just been a weird interest. But the way I would try to describe it to a normal person is just like GDP is almost everything that we care about, right? Like there's a few things that are, that we care about, like that the quality of the environment, or like, having good relationships with friends and stuff that aren't captured in GDP, but quite an awful lot is captured in GDP. And, in terms of, our standard of living, on the quality of the healthcare that we get, the opportunities to have cool experiences in life, all of that is captured up in GDP. It's just like one number that summarizes all of that in a sort of like very salient way. And GDP per capita, 200K is like, if we did about 4% growth for the next 30 years, that's what we'd get. And, like basically like nobody in the US would be poor, right? If we did this, right? Like everyone's like wealthy by today's standards. It would be amazing.
And why do you think people don't fully get this or fully appreciate this, or what's the bottleneck for more people understanding this?
I think people are mainly focused on their own lives, right? Like in sort of like a very near term, like, oh, I had a fight with my boss, or like, my sister's really annoying me, or like it's just so it's such a high level concept, and especially if you're thinking about the way it grows over decades, right? It's so abstract and not very tangible to a lot of people.
Yeah. So let's get into some of your ideas. You mentioned that scientific breakthroughs alone are not enough to drive an end to the great stagnation. Why is that the case?
It's really interesting because I'm like really optimistic about the capabilities of humans to like working together to make amazing discoveries. And I've actually become like a little bit pessimistic about our ability to translate them into products, because that's what you need to drive GDP, right? The gross domestic product. It needs to be a product. It needs to be adopted at scale. It needs to be used, right? And so I think there's a lot of people, including in the sort of like techno optimism category that I would identify with, who do a lot of like look at a lot of science porn and just like tweet out like headlines of amazing discoveries. And like you see a lot of those. I think very very often, especially in biotech or in biology, where it's like, wow, biology in the lab is amazing. We are doing incredible things. And then you think about like how long it takes for those to like work through the pipeline and become a product that people can use at scale that can improve their lives. It can take a long time. Like CRISPR was discovered in 2012. We've awarded a Nobel Prize for it. And, still no CRISPR product. I can't go to the CRISPR store and get anything done to me. I can't, like, we don't even have any approved treatments for diseases that have, gone their way through the approval process yet. So it's really that step. And there's a lot of people in my community that are working on ideas for how we can speed up science and make science better and improve science institutions. And I support their work 100%. But we also need to think about like, why is there a bottleneck from doing the basic science to like productizing the discovery in a way that people can use?
And is there more to understanding that than it's just really hard, or are there things that would make it easier, or a bit more about what it is?
I think it's like very contingent on the industry or like the specific discovery and so on. Like there's things like, not only like are they not new discoveries, but like so I spent a few years as the first policy hire at Boom Supersonic, and like we know that is possible, right? That is a product that existed and it's now gone away, and it is really hard to build a new supersonic jet, and 100% respect to everyone trying and still working on it. It's super hard. A lot of it's regulatory. A lot of it's like environmental standards have, our expectations have increased around that. So I think it's very dependent on the industry, right? And it's like in biotech, it's more about like what standards the regulators require, and a lot of like infrastructure stuff. It's, the sort of the paperwork that's involved going into it, et cetera. I don't think there's a unified answer, but the answer often ends up being very boring, right? Yeah. Like it's like procurement policy and permitting policy is like super important, but like also very boring.
We were talking about before this podcast about Robert Gordon and the broader thesis of progress has economic growth has slowed down. Patrick Collison, of course, and Tyler Cowen had this piece, or Michael Nielsen is science slowing down, and Jose Luis Ricon says it's an impossible question. We have to look sort of field by field and evaluate, where are we making progress, where are we not? And I think he says, we're not making progress in physics, for example. We are in bio. Where do you stand on sort of those macro questions?
I mean, my view is, for the most part, you can boil a lot of it down to GDP, right? So where I would differ with like Jose Luis is like he's looking at like the actual science breakthroughs, and I'm thinking a lot of it about in terms of how do those breakthroughs translate into effect on human lives, and we have a metric for if it if it's breaking through and affecting human lives, and that's GDP or total factor productivity. So I think that you can like sort of aggregate that and help figure it out. On Robert Gordon, his idea was you had these like 5 great inventions in the late 1800s that took a while to sort of like ramp up in terms of their scale. And then from 1920 to 1970, they produced this like unrepeatable spasm of like really rapid growth, 2% TFP growth per year on average. And then they kind of trickled out in 1970, and it's going to take a while for us to get that again. If I look at the world, I see so many boneheaded things that we're doing that, slow productivity growth that doesn't seem very convincing to me, because, we like housing is such a huge issue. We know how housing can be more productive, right? We it's like literally it's just build denser. Like, doesn't take a PhD in economics to say like build more housing, the price will fall. So I'm not so convinced by the sort of the reasoning that Gordon has for why we're slowing down. Although he's a very good and careful empirical economist, and I think he's done important work on documenting the past inventions, but I don't think his reason for the current stagnation is quite right.
And one of those main reasons is low hanging fruit.
Yeah, so he would say like there's these 5 great inventions are spent, right? Like we've gone through them all, right? There's no like we've had like one great invention in the last 20, 30 years, which is all the IT stuff, and that's just really not enough to drive really rapid growth. And so I think that there's like more on the horizon, more great inventions, but also just the whole great invention framework seems to be wrong, because there's so like nuclear costs 6 times as much in the US as in South Korea, right? It's not like there's no fundamental breakthrough that's needed to drive lower nuclear costs. It's like a regulatory and cultural thing.
Yeah. How would you rank the sort of top 5 boneheaded thing? You mentioned nuclear, you mentioned housing. What are others that come to mind?
Well, because I worked in supersonics for many years, like the fact that like we have a speed limit rather than a noise standard for sonic boom, that's like pretty boneheaded. Oh, let's see. I mean, like look at like the way we do drug approvals in this country. I think like with the think about like this pandemic and how long it took FDA to approve it, both the vaccines, but also, initially like a year ago, the lab developed tests for like whether or not you had COVID, right? So, and that was with like total scrutiny that like the world, the eyes of the US and of the world were on them, and they still like delayed it, right? Yeah. And so you have to think like they're completely indifferent to killing people through type 2 errors. They don't seem to care about that. So I think the way we do drug approvals is like another massive one.
Yeah. And I want to go into that, but first I want to zoom out, because, we talk about how much economic growth we've experienced and how much it's changed our lives. And yet there are, wide swaths of this country that are sort of reminiscing for times of old where it was, there was more job security and it seemed that things were just easier to afford. To what extent are those people either incorrect or to what extent is an appropriate response? Yes, but that's because of increased regulation in housing, healthcare, and education. And if you took those 3 things, then that would be most of their costs and their lives would be very different. What would you say to?
Well, I would say it's like 2 very different things that to think about. One is like the levels of economic welfare, and the other is the first time derivative, right? The rate of growth, right? And so in the past, we had an era with much lower levels of economic development, like we were poorer, right? But much faster growth. So people felt really good when the rate of growth was going up, even though the levels were lower, right? And so I think what it shows is it really matters that you sustain long-term economic growth, that you don't just like reach some level and then like stop, cut it off. One way I think about this is, we've seen in politics and so on, like a lot of zero-sum thinking, like a lot of populism, a lot of bad stuff. It's like because we have a zero-sum economy, right? An economy that doesn't grow is a zero-sum economy. The only way you can get richer is if somebody else gets poorer. And so it's really important to maintain that economic growth over a long period of time, basically indefinitely, so that we don't revert to that kind of thinking. And I think there is evidence that almost all of the the angst, of the economic angst that people feel, almost all of that's driven by housing, right?
Right.
So housing is like really like the original policy sin that has driven basically driven our country insane.
And the original sin, are you referring to sort of like Bill Clinton stuff, or just like encourage everyone to get a house? Or
No, I think it's a lot of zoning, basically like exclusionary stuff. Like we've raised the price of living in sort of the most productive parts of the country so much that it's basically hard to get ahead.
Yeah. But just to grill into, has the cost of living risen relative to income? Like, do we have stats on that in terms of just like the average person's, middle America's ability to get by?
Yeah. So, a lot of this is captured in inflation statistics. So we are, sort of like getting a little bit better every year in terms of, GDP, real GDP per capita, right? So we are wealthier than we were 50 years ago, wealthier than we were 30 years ago, wealthier than we were 20 years ago, et cetera. And it's just a question about, is it growing fast enough, right?
Yeah.
And if you're growing at 1% a year versus 3% a year, you really feel that difference when you extend it several decades.
Yeah. And so we're basically saying is that anyone who's wishing for an era of, 20 years ago or 5 years ago is, even in the middle America, is just kind of confused because they're just not seeing growth rise fast enough, but it has risen relative to where they were and relative to their costs rising.
They may not be confused in the sense of, they may be talking about what might have appealed to them about the past era was the rapid rate of growth. And like, they are right in the sense that we don't have that. Right. Yeah. And so I wouldn't,
but they don't,
I think they're describing a feeling that they have about the economy today, and their feeling is right.
Yeah. But I think they also say it was just easier to afford, a decent standard. It was easier to get a house. It was easier to get an education. It was easier to,
So a lot of that is correct. Of course, we have like much better, higher quality healthcare today. We have, much better cars, et cetera. And so if you do all the adjustment, I think that like BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, that does like the inflation adjustments, like they do a good job. Yeah. Right. And so like quality of life in a sort of like an objective, like static sense is higher today than it was then, but people still felt better then because their life was on a better trajectory.
Yeah. And to what extent, like, our housing, healthcare, and education, like, what percentage of costs do they represent, or what are the other, big costs that are not factored in there that just crush people?
Yeah, so I think housing and healthcare together are about like 34 or something percent of GDP. So like just massive, right? Healthcare is something like 17.7 last I checked, and housing, if you count all the construction plus the sort of imputed rent, it's quite high as well. So it's basically over a third are just those two sectors that have been utterly stagnating. And then the funny thing about these numbers is that you can think about it in terms of relative productivity by sector. So the sectors that have the lowest productivity growth, they tend to grow as a chunk of the overall GDP, right? So like the fact that if housing were like TVs, right, it would drop in cost. It would have dropped in cost by like orders of magnitude over the last few decades, and like we would spend next to nothing on housing, right? So it would become less important as a sector.
Yeah, that makes sense. I want to transition into some of the other topics that you get into in your piece. Let's start with biology. I want you to unpack this statement from your piece. Biology is proceeding faster than medical productivity because of a lot of the wonderful discoveries are not being translated into approved treatments and products at a decent rate. Let's salute and cheer for the discoveries, but spare many thoughts for the entrepreneurs trying to bring treatments to market. Can you expand on that?
Sure. Yeah, I think that the best example is CRISPR. That's such a breakthrough. Like, we've actually figured out how to edit the genome, but 9 years later, it's still no product, still no treatment. So it's actually really hard in the current regulatory environment to shepherd a drug or a medical discovery all the way through the process, especially if it is it's a chemical that people are going to be ingesting. So super challenging to do that. And much harder in some ways than the the fundamental science, which we all love and want to cheer and rightfully so. But it's the entrepreneurs have the harder job, I think.
So when we talk about mRNA, proteins, biotech, longevity, what's missing from the narrative here? What are we ignoring that we should be paying attention to, or vice versa?
I think the biggest thing that everybody's missing is how fundamental proteins are. Like proteins are what makes you alive, right? Like proteins do everything that matters in your body, right? And that's what unites like a lot of the recent breakthroughs. So mRNA is basically, it's a technology that lets you manufacture arbitrary proteins in your own cells. So it's like you inject some messenger RNA, your cell like reads those, right? It's like a very computery idea, but the ribosome like reads those in as instructions and like produces what it says, and hundreds or thousands of copies per mRNA molecule, right? So we have a way to make proteins arbitrarily, like the protein folding that the AlphaFold or DeepMind did last year. Like that is just such a huge breakthrough in our understanding of proteins, our ability to reason about them. And so you put those together and like spin it out a few years into the future, like we're going to be able to design proteins that are not natural, right? That do new things, and we're going to be able to make them, and we're going to be able to use CRISPR to like stitch them into our genome if we want to. And it's just such a huge breakthrough, because evolution doesn't give us the proteins that we need to live, to 120 years old. It doesn't give us the proteins that clear plaque from our veins, right, or our arteries. It doesn't give us the proteins that clear plaque from our nerves that prevent Alzheimer's. Right? It doesn't give us the proteins to rejuvenate ourselves. Why? Because it doesn't help at all with evolutionary fitness, the ability to reproduce. And so evolution has failed to give us the proteins that we need to do what we want to do now, which is live a long, healthy lives. And so proteins are just so fundamental to all of biology. If we master them, right, we can sort of, we can become like gods, right? Like it's kind of an intense thing. And then the other amazing thing about proteins is that they're basically on a molecular level, they're basically like machines, right? There are drive shafts, there's cabling, there's conveyor belts, and all of these components exist today as proteins. And nanotechnologists like Erik have argued like we can use this to bootstrap sort of like non-biological nano machines, right? So the ability to do atomically precise manufacturing and so on, like that's all going to come out of like this strain of work on proteins. So it's super fundamental to, I think, the future is mastering proteins.
That's fascinating. Let's transition into geothermal energy, where you've written quite a bit about. Why is this better than wind and solar? And what are the geopolitical implications of America becoming energy independent?
Geothermal is better than wind and solar because it's like better quality energy, right? It's available 24/7 without regard to, where the sun is in the sky, or where, if there's clouds, or whether the wind is blowing. And the thing to remember about the electricity grid is that it's got to remain in complete supply-demand balance every second of every day. So the exact same number of like electrons like going on as off. So it's really quite a hard thing to balance. And especially if you're relying on energy sources that are so intermittent, right? The wind can literally stop blowing 1 minute. And it's like, oh, you got to make that up. So, geothermal is just much higher quality in terms of the resource it provides. But then I think it's such a tiny niche today, but there are startups now working on advanced forms of geothermal that are super scalable and that essentially could be like anywhere in the country. If you drill deep enough in the ground, there's going to be heat, and you tap that resource. The center of the earth is like as hot as the surface of the sun, right? 6,000 degrees Celsius. And I think scientists have estimated that if you drill down, if you talk about like the amount of heat energy that's trapped between the surface and 10 kilometers down, so not that far down, 10 kilometers and the surface, it's 50,000 times as much energy as all our fossil fuel reserves. So like it's just a massive amount of energy, enough to do everything we might want to do as a species, it's like being replenished at like twice the rate of our primary energy consumption. So it's like never going to run out. It will last for billions of years. Like Earth will boil, like the oceans will boil before it goes away. And so it's never going to run out. And if we like sort of master this idea of, drilling down, like creating a closed loop, being able to place these literally anywhere, like underneath Manhattan, if we want to, like that's going to drive an era of energy abundance, right? Where we don't, over the last 30 years, we have done more with less, right? We use less energy today than we did in the late 1970s. I'm like, let's try doing more with more for a while. It's going to be really awesome to not try to conserve energy and just think about, well, what if I tripled my energy use? What amazing thing could I do? And no one's thinking that way right now. The geopolitical point that you asked about, I think it's interesting to think these things through, because energy is still very scarce in many parts of the world, notably East Asia. So like China has to import a lot of its energy from the Middle East. And so if you think about US foreign policy and the way that we have situated ourselves, we have allied essentially with Saudi Arabia as a sort of, distasteful way of supporting stability in the Middle East. And as we get to energy abundance in the U.S., we are already technically, I think, energy independent. We have more net exports than imports. But as that compounds and gets even more lopsided, we're going to be like, well, why are we partnering with the Saudis again? Like they literally dismember journalists. Let's not do that. And that I think that could be very destabilizing for the Middle East, and put a lot of hamper oil exports from the Middle East, which of course then affects Asia and by extension the rest of the world. So it's definitely an interesting chain of events to watch and to see if that plays out.
Yeah, and so on the geothermal side, why isn't it universally popular? Like, what are the best critiques or concerns about it?
I think it's not popular, and it's mainly ignorance. Like this is like super new tech that I'm talking about, right? So basically, I think that a lot of it's being accelerated now by the pandemic, by the fact that oil prices are really low, that oil companies have had to lay off a lot of drilling experts, and a lot of people are sort of pivoting from that oil and gas sector and thinking a lot about like, all the superpowers that they've developed in the shale revolution, right? To engineer the subsurface. They're taking those and now looking at, well, how can we apply them in new ways, in interesting ways? And they're sort of, converging on some of these ideas behind closed loop geothermal. And it's just super new. Geothermal has historically been a tiny, tiny niche, right? Like less than 1% of US electricity generation. And so to come along and say, well, actually we figured this out, and could be like 70%, within 20 years or 30 years, that's going to take people a while to process, I think.
That makes sense. And then let's say we went into space, and you also talk about why you're so excited about Starship. Talk about both those things and why you're so excited.
Well, Starship is just fascinating. If you kind of understand the history of launch costs and so on. So the way that we've launched rockets in the past, of course, has been just exorbitantly expensive, right? The space shuttle costs like $60,000 per kilogram in today's dollars to get stuff into space. And that retired in about 2011. There's been other launch companies that have come along to serve like the US government as a launch customer. And because the US government only launches on US companies, like they've had this sort of monopoly, and they've gotten very fat and happy on pretty expensive launch prices, 10,000 or more per kilogram to space. And SpaceX comes along first with the Falcon 9, which is like a 4x cost reduction over those other companies, and just sort of like eats their lunch, right? And today the Falcon 9 launches 2/3 of the payload to orbit of the world, right? So just that one rocket. And then Elon's coming along with this Starship program, and he's like, we're going to get 200x better than Falcon 9, like 200x, like 2 orders of magnitude better than the rocket that just ate everybody's lunch. in terms of launch costs. It's just staggering. Like you're going to be able to launch, for $10 a kilogram, you're going to be able to, launch people who just want to go. You're going to be able to launch, industrial stuff into space. I mean, like forget just thinking about, so far satellites have been communications and Earth observation, like pictures. And we're going to be able to do a lot more. We're going to be able to put stuff in space, bring it back down. We're going to be able to do low gravity manufacturing. We're going to be able to mine, at some point, probably not in the next 10 years, but not too far away, right? You're going to be able to mine stuff in space, like bring it back to orbit, like use it there, and then going to the moon is also super important, right? I'm super enamored of the idea of like putting a lunar telescope array on the far side of the moon. I think that's like a super interesting scientific idea. And then of course, going to Mars, like Elon's vision of like making humanity a multiplanetary species is so fundamental to everything he does, right? That's how you interpret Elon, is like everything he does is about Mars. The electric vehicles is like, well, we can't use internal combustion engine on Mars. The boring companies like, well, we're going to need underground stuff on Mars. So, and Starship is the vehicle that's going to get us to Mars. The only way you're going to be able to do a sort of like mass colonization is to get something, quite a lot like Starship. It's just like a revolution that's happening like right before our eyes, and like most people aren't even watching it yet.
Yeah. So you think 2020 is the decade of atoms, huh?
I want it to be, right? Like I think that there's like this possibility that it is, if we don't regulate it to death, or if we don't like do all the stuff that we do to slow everything down. I think it's totally possible.
My friend John Luddig wrote this piece about what happens when tailwinds sort of collapse, and he's basically saying that the internet is mature. His bearish thesis on 2020 is that the internet is maturing. Pretty soon, everyone will have cell phones. All commerce will be on. Like at some point, we will have tapped that well, and we've just been relying on these tailwinds, and so we will need new tailwinds. And he's not as confident as you probably on the timeline for some of these newer ones to emerge. So let's talk about optimism, pessimism first on the 20s. What do you think is the strongest sort of of each argument?
I think it's like technologically optimistic, but culturally pessimistic. So as I look at these different buckets, right, the number of technical steps that we have to do to like get from where we are to like a lot of these amazing things is like pretty small. And it's like, seems like it works in principle. A lot of times it's like the amount of money that you need to get there is like not that high. Like there's people who want to work on it, et cetera. So it's like the pieces are there. We could do it. The argument for pessimism is, we might not do it, right? We might not do it for, basically reasons of our own choice. For a whole number of reasons, we just culturally, we seem incapable of just looking at a problem and solving it in the most tractable, like straightforward way. And I think like climate change is a great example, right? Like we have barely tried to solve climate change, like from an engineering perspective. We've barely tried it, like wind and solar energy, or like a piece of it, but and electric cars as well. And like those are great, but like that's not the full scope of what we could do. And instead, what we're doing is like we're arguing about like whether to raise or lower the status of scientists who tell us that climate change is an important problem, or whether to raise or lower the status of, in some countries it's automobile companies, right? Like, so like Germany is like, well, we can't lower the status of our automobile companies. And so like, that's like inhibiting action there. So I see it as a sort of like conflict between that sort of like more engineering mindset of like, let's go and solve these problems, and the mindset of, there's a lot of like status competition, culture war, et cetera. And we've got to first look and see who's raised and lowered in status before we decide on if a policy is a good idea. And it's like totally backwards. We should look at the material effects of the policy before then decide on that basis whether or not to pursue it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, another variation of the question could be like, how do we use the fact that people are status driven, like for our own ends, in the sense of like, if we had more wide belief on GDP I mean, humans love gamifying things. If people really bought into GDP and we could see like how much people contribute to GDP, and then, sort of like give status to people who contribute a lot instead of like coming, outside of their house with guillotines, that it sounds like it seems like that could have a big effect, but it would require us to develop the cultural sort of like tools and knowledge to make that, widely understandable and high status and cool.
Yeah, that would be. I think that would be great. It would be sound super hard to me. I think
harder than engineering problems.
Yes, harder than engineering problems. Like people are really complex and difficult to deal with. Like I think a lot of it is like maybe driven by media, right? Like mass media, and like you can think about the internet as pouring rocket fuel on like previous mass media revolutions. But like in the 1930s, like people were still status conscious. But like they were status conscious, like on the scale of like their neighborhood or their city or whatever, and like the scope of that culture war was small, right? Yeah. So you didn't spend a lot of time. It didn't occupy your thoughts like 24/7 the way it does to a lot of people now. And so there's still a lot of scope for growth in that environment. But if every single change is like, well, what if this policy change like lowers the status of teachers? Well, we can't have that, right? And it's not even discussed.
What is the best critique of GDP that you've heard, or even in the sense of like best understanding of limitations of GDP that you've heard, and how do you respond to it?
I think there's a lot of like very fair points made about, well, it doesn't capture environmental benefits, right? It doesn't capture a lot of the things that we care about as humans, right? Our relationships. You could be a super wealthy person, a super productive person, and just be absolutely miserable in your personal life because your marriage is crappy, or like your kids hate you or whatever. So I think it's like not absolutely everything by any means. Like maybe the ultimate critique is like the Buddha, like it's all in your head anyway. Like so you should be able to be happy no matter what. I sort of just take for granted that we're very we're wired the way we are, as primates. So GDP still matters. I wouldn't actually dispute any of those critiques. I think it's right. It's just GDP is a pretty good proxy and covers a lot more than most people would give it credit for.
Yeah, we were talking about Robert Gordon again, but before you mentioned that you're writing your next piece delving into some of his claims. Were there other parts of that argument that we didn't get to yet cover in terms of what your next piece is?
No, I don't think so. I think we covered it pretty well. It's great inventions, it's proteins, it's geothermal, it's culture war, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Where at all do you disagree with Tyler Cowen?
That's a great question. So Tyler is my advisor. I've read almost everything he's ever written, and we see eye to eye on a lot of things. I think one place that's interesting is an interesting difference is in crypto. I've been following crypto since like 2011. Been super interested in it, and so he kind of was a little bit dismissive of it in the early days. And I was like, yeah, this is revolutionary, right? The idea of like a centralized, logically centralized, but physically decentralized way of having a source of truth. I think that's like a data structure that's like super important, like for all time from here on out. So we disagreed on that. And I think, he's gotten more crypto friendly, but I think even our views still are like a little bit apart in terms of like, he's still thinking in terms of Bitcoin is probably like gold. And I think much more in terms of the sort of the data structures and what you could build off on top of it.
Bryan Caplan.
Oh, I disagree with like tons of stuff that Bryan Caplan thinks, but I love him to death. Bryan has a very simplistic idea of human nature in terms of I think he thinks like we're all more capable of being rational than we are in a lot of ways. So he would say like, if you struggle with wanting one thing while also wanting something else that's contradictory, like you can make that choice like completely rationally and in a straightforward way. So like if you're an alcoholic and you say you love your kids and you'll give up drinking for your kids, and then you're unable to do that, that just shows revealed preference that you don't love your kids or something like that. Like that seems wrong to me. Like I think that those human struggles are very, very real, and maybe that's like the most fundamental way in which I would disagree with Bryan.
How about Peter Thiel?
0 to 1 was like transformative for me. Like, I was taking over the tech policy program at Mercatus around that time that book came out, and sort of read it. And like, that's like part of the reason why I like shifted my research into hard tech. What is he wrong about? Well, he's really, I think maybe it's again, it's like crypto. Like he's like really into Bitcoin. I'm much more of an Ethereum guy. That's like a very specific thing. He doesn't say everything he thinks, right? So you don't know what he thinks. He's very Straussian. He's very careful about what he says. I would hesitate to go beyond sort of like those like very clear public statements.
Yeah. A decade ago, you wrote a blog post saying why you're not a libertarian. Do you still feel the same way today? And maybe unpack the main argument?
Sure. So I would say my political views are not exactly the same as they were a decade ago, but at the same time, I would say I'm still not a libertarian. So that was an idea pushed by Will Wilkinson, who's a friend, on about like basically that libertarians should become more friendly with the left rather than the right, and you know, maybe it's true that I think that libertarians should not be like that closely aligned with the right, but it's probably also true in my view that like should not be that closely aligned with the left. You should just like try to like seek truth and seek like practical ways to advance human freedom as much as possible, and that's probably my most fundamental view is like kind of like stay out of the like that kind of like political fight, and just think about like what's the right way to play the system without sort of like allegiances to ideology to create the world you want to create.
What's something else that you've fundamentally changed your mind on, you think?
Oh man, that's a tough question. I mean, I don't want to sound like I'm sure of myself or anything, because I think fundamentally like I've just I've become less sure of a lot of things. I wrote my dissertation on anarchy, right? So arguing that it was possible for it to be stable, and sort of like a few years before I started working on that, like, I was like, oh, that's stupid. Like I had some friends who were like talking about that. So I wrote this, started working on it. I was like, oh, okay, there's an idea here on like how it could be stable, and I found it really intellectually engaging, and at the same time, like I didn't come away from it. By the time I was done, like I was like less an anarchist than I was like in the middle of it, right? So like sort of convinced myself like in a million different directions. Like sort of went one way, then went another way, and then like came out where I'm at, and I think the more you dive into a lot of these topics, it's like you come away less sure.
Have you bought into the state capacity?
Yeah,
framing?
Yeah, I think Tyler's right on, and sort of the idea of you want a government that is capable in the domains in which it acts, right? And like COVID is like a great example. Like you want the government to do a good job. A lot of my other work is really focused on that. So I think a lot about permitting and the way that we do environmental review in this country, which can take years. It's basically, I think it's like an attack on state capacity, right? Like you make it so the federal government has to spend years of like doing paperwork, making sure, holding public meetings, making sure there's like notice and comment periods, et cetera, before they can make like even the simplest decisions.
Yeah.
And it's basically like you're crushing essentially state capacity when you do that.
So you did some work with Samuel Hammond. Any immediate interesting disagreements with him?
Tons of disagreements with Sam. So Sam worked with me when he was back when he was a master's student at Mercatus, and we worked together for I think a couple of years, and we wrote a paper called "Make America Boom Again" on bringing back supersonic flight. so Sam like took a turn away from a lot of the tech issues and is really focused on, so like social welfare policy and stuff like that. And like most fundamentally, like I think like Sam shouldn't have done that. It's like Sam should have kept working on tech, right? Like it's like more important in the long run. So maybe that's like the fundamental disagreement. But then just Sam's really big on social insurance, and I think like social insurance is not insurance, right? Like it's not conceptually the same thing. It's not a good metaphor. So maybe that's like what I disagree with him on now.
Yeah, it's interesting. There are people who say some things like, "Hey, we have to build outside of the government," like biology, for example. We have to build institutions outside of the government and sort of, like disrupt it over time. And then people say, come on, like this isn't, this is the government. Like we need to make it better and work within it. And like, what do you say to that conversation?
It's super interesting. I mean, I've argued with biology like many times at DM. I would say I'm actually maybe in the middle of it, right? Like I think that building completely outside of the state is not going to work, right? Like you rely, we realistically rely on the state for so much, and probably need to for the foreseeable future. At the same time, we should be like looking at ways to limit the state's power through technology, right? Use encryption so that you can't have a genocide or something like that. Like that's like worthwhile stuff to do and to try to focus on. I'm glad that there's people out there like trying to build outside the state, but I think like the short run prospects for that are really, really bad. And I think it's important to just build capacity, build competence in a lot of the agencies. And there is actually like a ton of talent in a lot of the government. It's a lot of times it's the incentives that are wrong. It's not even the talent that is the problem.
Totally. Maybe let's close by talking about the progress studies movement and some of just the level of thinking they're in. You wrote a post about it, a couple of years ago when it first sort of was proposed. What have we seen? What's your sort of like, what is the state of the movement? What's your sort of perspective on it? Where should it go? And one thing I'll just say really quick is it seems that there's like, to our earlier point of making it culturally interesting and important, it seems there's two different approaches. One is sort of, I guess, just because we mentioned biology, sort of the transhumanist approach, the biology approach, sort of like leaning into, longevity and other sort of transcendent, sort of ideas. And then the other is just the way I put progress studies in this approach of just like, this gets a billion people out of poverty, or this is just a very practical, today ramifications. And I don't know which one is more effective in winning hearts and minds in a scalable way. But yeah, I'm curious for your perspective.
Well, I think it's like amazing that there's a progress studies movement, right? Like I think it's great that people are thinking about it at all. I think it's like interesting to think about like the schisms within the progress studies movement. So I think like one is that you have a lot of people who are approaching it primarily on the historical side of like led to progress in the past, and how can we study what are the lessons we can pull from history to think about. And then there's other people, and I would put myself more in this camp of like being very forward looking and not looking at the past and just charging ahead and figuring out how in our current situation we can drive things in a productive way. And then maybe like another sort of, maybe not schism, but like a dividing line is people who think a lot about scientific institutions and how to accelerate the pace of science versus people who are, again, I would put myself in this latter camp of think about like applying science and commercializing it as the biggest barrier or the biggest obstacle to progress. So like, trying to, reform basic research institutions versus like, oh man, there's a lot of barriers from getting the science into the hands of consumers, or the breakthrough into the hands of consumers. I think that's like another interesting divide. But I just think it's phenomenal that like there's like a small but growing community of people that are interested in these questions at all, and like it's super fun to have that as like sort of like a rallying point.
How do you expect it to evolve going forward?
I don't know. I don't spend a lot of time worrying about how it's going to evolve. I think it will evolve spontaneously. I hope it grows, right? Like that's my big
Yeah.
my big concern is that we get more and more people who are interested in improving welfare, right? Improving human lives, and that's like, draw as many people as you can into it, and then hopefully we get some movement.
Yeah. And in terms of you going forward, in terms of how you'll want to spend time in the next few years and the projects you'll want to pick up, how do you foresee?
I have, like plenty, like my research list is like super long. I am very interested in sort of like the actual hands-on tech world as well. Like, so not going to announce a startup, but I have been thinking about startup ideas and including like pretty revolutionary ones. And we'll see. But for now, my research pipeline is quite long.
Awesome. Do you have a request for research or request for project, like people who are sort of intrigued by the ideas that we've been talking about, things that you might like to see more people pursue?
I would like to see people push the limits of like what's allowed under the regulations. So one of the things I talked about in the post, in the notes on technology in the 2020s post, was blood plasma dilution, right? And so what's interesting about that is it's proven in mice to rejuvenate tissues and stuff like that. It's also approved for human use, right? So like this is already something that for a whole range of conditions, not including aging and longevity, but for a whole range of other conditions, like you are allowed under the FDA for like a doctor can prescribe this to you. And so like I want to see people like push the boundaries of what's allowed under the current system, and like there is, as far as I can tell, no legal obstacle to you like opening up a clinic and being like, I'm going to dilute your blood and we're going to have a doctor here to like sign the prescription form and we can do this. And then maybe more generally, I think the tech community is like too afraid of regulatory obstacles. So like just like don't don't decline an investment because of regulatory risk. Don't like not stop a company because of regulatory risk. Like these risks, they are real, but they are often very addressable. So in my experience, in basically like my first year at Boom, like we got like the FAA to completely reverse their interpretation of the supersonic landing and takeoff noise rules, right? And like no one thought we were going to be able to do that, but it is doable to do that. So I would say like don't shy away from regulated spaces, because that's where all the interesting action happens.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to wrap. My guest has been Eli Dourado. If you like what you heard today, he has his blog is a fantastic source of deep dives and new ideas. Eli, any other plugs you have for our audience?
You can follow me on Twitter as well, Eli Dourado on Twitter.
Awesome. Thanks for coming on the episode.
Thanks for having me.
If you're an early stage entrepreneur, we'd love to hear from you. Check us out at villageglobal.vc.